Hello Yoshi players out there, I'm Yoshi Player and welcome back to the Dick Figures review series. Last time I did a marathon with all the okay episodes, and now this marathon will have all of the bad episodes. Now when I say an episode is bad, I think it's a reasonable explanation. I just thought the episode was bad. It doesn't mean I think an episode is awful in some ways, I just thought it was a bad experience. It may have had a couple of good qualities in there, but for the most part, it just had a lot of bad content. But with that out of the way, let's begin. Episode 4, Traffic Jams. Red and Blue end up in a traffic and they listen to some jams. Yeah, that's why this episode's called Traffic Jams. Now, you can tell by the tone of my voice that something's not right with this episode. And to be frank, there really isn't. I mean, I don't think this episode is awful, but there were some things I did have problems with. First off, since this episode's short, there isn't that many jokes in this episode. And even though there are jokes, I really didn't find them as funny as the episodes before. Red's listening to jams at one point, breaks the airbag, says he needs another airbag. Okay, that joke was actually really funny. There's this ending with a giant turtle dragon. It's funny and it works, but I don't think that's really enough to hold up for how much I don't like this episode. Yeah, sorry guys, but I think this is a bad episode. Now, when I say this episode's bad, it is in a very interesting way. When I say this episode's bad, that doesn't mean I say it's unwatchable. It's definitely watchable, and I can totally understand why there's people that like this episode. But, if I'm going to be honest, I really didn't like this episode that much. Granted, there was some funny stuff, and Season 1's usually got lots of funny stuff, but there's just not that many jokes in this episode due to the fact that this episode's short. The ending also felt forced, so yeah, I think this is a bad episode. Don't get mad, this is just my personal opinion. But maybe you see something that I can't see. Episode 15, Fang Angels. Blue and Pink watch a movie and Red tries to get out of jail, but that's really much it. There isn't that many things that happen in this episode because, again, it's a short. And this short episode really doesn't have many jokes. I mean, Blue and Red are just talking on the phone, that's it. There is a couple jokes at the beginning with Blue and this whole dick thing, and that was kind of funny, but that's really the only thing I laughed about in this episode. They're watching some sort of Twilight ripoff, which I suppose is supposed to make me laugh, but to be honest, I really didn't care about it. It just kind of made me frown a little bit. And that's really the best way to describe this episode. It just didn't make me smile. Well, it did a little bit, but that only happens so rarely. I think this episode was kind of rushed. Although a highlight, I love seeing Pink's boobs. Don't take that the wrong way. But how would I rate this episode? Well, there's not too many jokes, and none of them really made me laugh a lot. There was the whole highlight I just mentioned before, which I know is going to gross people out. But unfortunately, I just didn't have a lot of fun with this episode. So I'm going to go ahead and say it's just a bad episode, and I really skip it every time I'm watching Season 2. Episode 16, Captain Red Rum and the Pina Colada Armada. Holy crap, that was a long title. Anyway, in this episode, Red and Blue try to hunt for mermaids. And that's pretty much it. There's not that many things to say about this episode because, to be honest, much like Fang Angels, I really didn't enjoy this episode. Though to be fair, I didn't enjoy this episode a lot. Because the biggest problem I have with this episode is that it's just not interesting. I mean, nothing really happens in this episode. Red and Blue are just kind of being pirates, that's about it. There's a few jokes, but even the jokes didn't really save this episode. They weren't that funny for me, and I really think they came out as jokes I've seen before. There's a whole subplot with Red and Pink and her army, but that only comes on for about a few seconds. Maybe it could have been the main plot of this episode where they're trying to find something worthy and it's a competition between them. That would have been a really, really good idea for this episode. But because the writers only have 2 minutes to fill in for an episode, that's really all they can do. Not even the ending with Lord Tourette's made me laugh. I know it's supposed to be played for laughs, but honestly, I just didn't find it that funny. So yeah, I think this is a bad episode, and really not worth any watching. Episode 23, Terminator. Red, now transformed into a T-18, attempts to locate his enemy at a Halloween party. Where on earth do I even begin with this episode? First off, I'm now going to take this episode calmly because I realize it's just a cartoon that's not trying to harm anything that's actually happened before. But I'm still going to admit this is still a very, very heart-wrenching episode. So where do I begin? Well, let's talk about the jokes. The jokes in this episode are cringeworthy. I mean, it's been 3 decades since Terminator, and we're still getting all of these Terminator jokes? Seriously? They get very old in this episode, and one of the main problems that Dig Figures has always had is that they rely on one joke throughout the entire episode. The reason they do this is usually because they can't think of any other clever jokes for the episode, or they think it's just a way to make you laugh because they think it's funny. No, they don't get that excuse. Using a joke throughout the entire episode doesn't make it funny, it just makes it become boring. Then let's talk about Red. I thought it was unnecessary for him to be in this episode. And when I say that, I mean, did he really need to have a major plot? I mean, he could have just been there as a cameo appearance. But then again, I really didn't want him to be in this episode. He just really didn't have anything to do, and neither did the plot itself. It could have just been a very funny Halloween party, lots of stuff could have been happening. We don't need to rely on a Terminator plot that we've seen before. It's not funny, it just kinda makes you bored. And then, all the stuff that happens to Blue. He was treated the worst in this episode. Finally having some luck in his life with a hot chick, and thanks to Red and Pink, he gets so miserable. And I know some people are like, oh, but Blue was cheating on his girlfriend. Well, were they even confirmed in a relationship at that time? I mean, I heard that their relationship wasn't confirmed until the movie. I think back then they were just kinda hanging out. They didn't even kiss until the movie, so I think back then they were just very close friends. And there's a very interesting thing about this episode I want to talk about. This Sarah Connor's chick is supposed to be the main antagonist of this episode, but not until the end do you realize that she was supposed to be the main antagonist. Even if she wasn't, she was still a very kind person to Blue, even though it was really a man under that suit. In fact, this scene kinda reminded me a bit of Transformers Revenge of the Fallen. Yeah, does anyone remember that movie? I don't really care. But even though she's supposed to be the villain, I really don't hate her. The character I do hate, though, is Pink. They made her a despicably unlikable antagonist in this episode, because they tried making her that way in the stupidest way possible. She's just jealous? Really? God, I could have so much more bad things to say about this episode. Even at the beginning, her behavior towards Blue was just really unacceptable. I mean, she couldn't even handle the simplest slight of criticism, and yet she still whines and complains like a 4-year-old over it, even going as far as throwing a glass of water at Blue's face. Don't you think that could have damaged him? If you ask me, that's a very, very selfish thing to do, but I really don't want to talk about this episode far enough. It's clearly a bad episode. And not just bad, but just absolutely awful. It's not funny, the characters are completely idiotic, there's nothing funny about this episode, it's really boring, and you just feel sorry for Blue because he's being pushed around by a bunch of idiots. I really loathe this episode, and I highly recommend you don't watch this episode, because I never want to ever again. Episode 25, Planet Asshole. Red and Blue offer some visiting aliens painful advice regarding face washing, relaxation, and reproduction. There's a lot of stuff I don't like about this episode. Though I'll get to the main problems later. Let's talk about the aliens. Honestly, I don't like the aliens. Well, in a kind of strange way. I'm not saying I hate them because they're rude, but because they're just not that interesting. Though to be fair, I do feel sorry for them later on the episode, which we'll take a look at in just a moment. This episode does throw in some funny jokes regarding the whole face washing, relaxation, and reproduction thing, which I suppose was probably the funniest part about this episode. However, does that do enough to save this episode? Because there is one problem I have with this episode. That main problem is Red and Blue themselves. They were really unlikable in this episode. The way they're pushing around the aliens and that they don't get punished for it at the end just kind of makes you hate them. This is probably one of the only episodes where Blue was also an unlikable character. Does that mean I have to change him from 1 to 2nd favorite character? And of course, like I said, this is also one of the many episodes where I just hated Red, because he was also being the same way as Blue in this episode. The aliens died. All they wanted was some food. They weren't gonna harm anyone. Red and Blue were just pushing him around because they were different. I don't like a story like that. It doesn't come across as funny, but rather just really stupid and mean-spirited. Now, to be fair, I am glad that none of the bad stuff happens to Blue in this episode, and rather more of the mean-spirited humor happens towards the aliens. But really, what's the difference? It's nice that not everything is happening to Blue in this episode, but still, you do kind of feel sorry for the aliens, even if you don't really like them as a whole. There's nothing really more I can say about this episode. It's just a bad episode for me, and I really, really wish that it wasn't even there. Thankfully, though, this episode isn't as bad as Terminator, because like I said, it did do a couple things right, and it's not one of the worst episodes I've ever seen either. Episode 32. Pussy Magnet. Red offers Blue advice to help reignite his sex life. There's a lot of things I don't like about this episode. First of all, the plot just sounds really, really dumb. Even on paper, it doesn't sound like a very good idea. And of course, the way it executed just felt lazy. This episode's basically saying that women are stupid to fall for anything that Red does, when really I know that women are more smarter than that. The different ways that Red tries to impress all the women in this episode is really, really stupid, and probably something that not every man would be able to succeed with. And that's also why I knew that Blue wasn't going to be able to win at the end of the episode. And spoiler alert, he really doesn't. Every character, aside from Blue of course, is an absolute idiot in this episode because they have no idea what the heck they're doing is even right, or they're just too stupid to even realize someone else's pain. Let's also talk about the ending. A lot of people keep saying to me that the ending to this episode is actually funny, but me, I really didn't even crack a smile, because since everything was silent and I knew that any second Blue was going to burst in and start shouting, I pretty much predicted that was going to happen. And much like Terminator, I have some real issues with Pink again. Look, I know she was shocked by what Blue did, but to be honest, it was all Red's fault. Red was the one that taught Blue all these things, and I knew that he wasn't going to succeed with it, but the fact that she just shot her own boyfriend, and she didn't even care. She just asked why he bothered to do it, and she just does it out of anger. I really don't like that. Even if someone's boyfriend did something stupid to them, causing them to accidentally or probably purposely hurt them, they probably still get worried about them and try to help them out. But unfortunately for Pink, she really didn't in this episode, and I really hate that. But like I said, I really don't think this episode is worth watching. It's a bad episode, and a really, really awful one at worst. Episode 33, Taco Tuesday. After being caught trying to escape from an Italian restaurant without paying, Red and Blue are forced to deliver pizzas. There's a lot of stuff I really don't like about this episode. I could make a joke that this episode begins with the Happy Tree Friends title card, because really, this episode tries to be like Happy Tree Friends, a show that I already despise so much on Mondo's channel. I don't like it when an animated series I like is trying to be something that I don't like. I never expected Ed and Zach to fuck up this badly. And you know what's funny? There's a behind the scenes video of this episode, and after watching it, I can clearly say they just tried to throw in a lot of really, really rushed ideas, which is probably one of the reasons why this episode doesn't work. So as you can tell, there's a lot of really violent jokes in this episode, and a lot of them aren't that funny. Now, it doesn't gross me out, because it's just a simple little stick figures cartoon, and doesn't gross me out as much as something like Happy Tree Friends or The Drone, which I never want to talk about again, by the way. But even at jokes, this episode just really, really rushes those jokes right through just to get it all done. There's way too many jokes being thrown at you in this episode. And there's the idea of, hey, we did that joke once, let's do it again, when they run over several different people. There's a lot of this episode I really hated. And it just angers me that Ed and Zach just tried to make this episode as quick as they can and not try to think through on what exactly they should make to make this episode actually enjoyable. As is, it's really, really boring, and it's easily one of the worst episodes I've ever seen. It's a bad episode, alright. Episode 34, Ocho Muerte. Blue's romantic cooking for Pink is interrupted by Red arriving to feed his pet octopus, Ocho Muerte, and chaos happens. Now, I'm gonna get this out of the way. This episode, thankfully, isn't as bad as Taco Tuesday. However, there's still a lot of things this episode does wrong. However, the only thing this episode did do was the animation for Ocho Muerte. He was a very well animated character, and to think he become the main antagonist in the Dick Figures movie, that's actually not such a bad thing to do. But everything else this episode just throws at you is really, really irritating. Let's talk about Red. again. He has no purpose in this episode. Maybe as a cameo at the beginning just to let Blue know about the octopus. The whole episode is just Blue trying to get in and rescue Pink. There's no need for Red to be in this episode. It's up to this point that I can realize that the devs just want to throw Red into the episode because they think it's going to be funny, when really, it's not. You could use so many more jokes for the other characters. Look at what Chick Figures Nerf Gas did. It didn't have to have Scarlet throughout the whole episode, it just had her at the beginning of the episode. The whole episode was just focused around Lavender. That's why that episode worked. You don't need to have Red in this episode. And another reason why I don't think he's in it is because of the ending. Fuck Red at the ending. He doesn't do anything good other than just throwing his knife at Blue's head because the devs think it's gonna be funny. It's not! It's just really stupid. And I can basically sum up this episode as an everything bad happens to Blue episode. That's true! All Blue wanted to do was cook a romantic meal for Pink, and Red comes in with this stupid octopus and ruins everything, and even doesn't get consequences for it, and just decides to throw a knife at his own friend's head. Red's stupidity can sometimes be taken to the worst level, and this episode is no exception. It's clearly a very, very bad episode, and quite frankly, one of the worst episodes I have ever seen because it just does everything so lazily bad. Episode 36, The Red Devil. After getting lost in Mexico, Red and Blue find themselves enlisted as mules in a burrito smuggling operation. I can basically sum up this episode in one word. Stupid. It's really, really stupid. The plot, how it's executed, the ending, there's just a lot of stuff this episode does that's very, very stupid. The plot itself just goes nowhere. At first it turns into a we gotta get home plot, and then turns into a whole smuggling operation that doesn't really need to be there. This episode's called The Red Devil, right? I thought it'd be some sort of Prince and Pauper stuff where Red and the Red Devil get mixed up. Hell, the two characters look the same. Maybe we could have got a more interesting plot out of that idea. But no, they stuck to this other plot so they can throw in a lot of really stupid jokes. And like I said, the jokes come in out of nowhere, they make no sense, and they're not funny. The ending is also very, very forced. Red and Blue just kind of drive off the edge and they get killed, and honestly, that's a very, very rushed execution to such a stupid, stupid episode. It's a bad episode, and like I said, really fucking stupid. The Red Planet. Red and Blue travel to Mars and meet a Mars rover robot. I will say, the opening to this episode was actually really good. But that doesn't quite make up for how slobby and formulaic this episode is. But like I said, I think the opening is good. I like the joke about how NASA is changing everything up and how the two astronauts didn't realize it was an actual plane. And the joke about the Mars rover being worth $13 trillion and how you can't wreck it was clever and made me think that dick figures can be more than just fart jokes and extreme cartoon violence. But like I said, the episode really goes downhill as soon as we see the rover robot. This character is obnoxious, and he's easily one of the most unfunny characters I've ever seen in the Dick Figures. I could basically sum up the robot as being red, but a robot, and it's not really missing anything. It's just not appealing. But the biggest problem? The episode just feels like a typical Dick Figures episode. And at this point, it's just getting really bland and stupid. Red always gets what he wants, Blue is unlucky 24/7, a silly mashup puts Red and Blue in some semi-crazy situation, and there's a 50-50 chance of a happy or an unhappy ending. And that ending... that ending was one of the worst endings I've ever seen, and it felt like a giant middle finger to the audience, with the creators thinking, we don't have any more ideas and less than a minute left, so let's just do this ending, and we don't care if the audience will be happy or not, because they have stuck with us for nearly 4 years and will watch anything even into this complete shit. It's a real shame, because I would have come to really, really like this episode, but the way it was executed just felt lazy. It's a bad episode, and one of the worst that I've ever seen. Episode 48, Trash God. Red and Blue shrink to ant size and Red becomes a trash god. God, where do I even begin with this episode? First, let's start off with the plot. This is nothing new. The whole idea of characters being shrunk to ant-sized, they meet a group of ants and something interesting happens. I've seen it participated much better in other movies. But that's not the thing I hate the most about this episode. Let's just talk about Red. I hated Red in this episode. He was at his absolute worst. Where do I even begin? He gets rewarded for being a disgusting person, and earlier in the episode we immediately forgive him for stomping on the ants, yet we can't forgive Blue for cleaning up his room, as it's so much worse than Red stomping on ants. I hated that so much, and I thought it made no sense whatsoever. This episode is basically saying to me that Red never has to deal with any problems at all, yet he still gets what he deserves at the end. Blue has to deal with every single one of them, and he still doesn't get anything good at the end. Most of the time, it's usually just Red with a happy ending and Blue with the unhappy ending. This is getting repeated and repeated so much again, and it's very frustrating. This episode barely lacked any comedy and instead just gave us a predictable ending. This ending was one of the worst endings I have ever seen in a Dick Figures episode, and I really hated Red for deciding to shrink Blue even more and then eating him. At this point, you'll believe that Red and Blue should never be friends. A true friend wouldn't do that, as proven in the ending of the Dick Figures movie. I hate just how innocent people think that Red is. They think he's an innocent character throughout this entire episode, yet he did something probably just as bad as Blue. It's fine when Dick Figures doesn't make sense, but in this case, it is just horrendously awful. This is a bad episode, and by far, the worst episode I have ever seen of any animated show ever. I hope to God that I never have to watch this episode ever again. Episode 51. New Kid. Red and Blue bully Sasquatch at high school. Alright, let's talk about some of the good stuff about this episode. First of all, the backgrounds in this episode are actually kinda good. In fact, they kinda remind me a bit of Dick Figures the movie. Even though not entirely, the backgrounds do look pretty detailed. And unlike the other two episodes, this episode does have a reasonable explanation for why Sasquatch is even pissed off, because Red literally tried to throw a bucket onto his head, and knowing Red, that's a pretty douchey thing for him to do. But unfortunately, this episode was bogged down by so many problems. First of all, the animation is just awful. Like I said, the backgrounds are nice, but the actual movement of the characters is so slow and so choppy. I don't understand why. The characters should be moving fluidly. There's even some points where it looks like it's supposed to be in the same frame rate, but other times the characters move so fucking slow. I don't know why. There's literally one scene where Red drops a bucket onto Sasquatch's head, and it moves so choppy. I don't know if it's supposed to be in slow motion or something, but still, it looked pretty bad. Finally, Blue didn't even do anything in this episode to deserve being punished. I mean, yeah, I suppose he did kind of tag along with Red when he was throwing the bucket of beef jerky onto Sasquatch's head, but that's really the only thing he did. He didn't do anything to straight up harm him, it was all Red's idea. In fact, even the characters in this episode do feel a little bit off. Red's a big jerk, and Blue doesn't exactly act like the nervous guy he is. I know it's because they're probably in high school, but still, this kind of bothers me. You know what I hate the most? The fact that this is a Messin' with Sasquatch episode pretty much gave me the entire idea down. That it was just gonna be an episode where Red and Blue piss him off, and they get beat up. The end. It's basically the same thing for all three of these episodes, and it's so annoying. In total, this is a bad episode, and it's a pretty bad way to start off this series of episodes. Episode 52, Campfight. Sasquatch interrupts Red and Blue's camping trip and messes everything up. By this point, I think the creators of Dick Figures are really beginning to run out of ideas. So much so that they're still doing these episodes about an overpriced snack. This episode just pretty much had nothing good at all. I will say though, the animation is better better and does stick to the Dick Figures animation style, but only because the animation is not that choppy as last time. Red is just ridiculous in this episode, and when he came out all buffed, I groaned instead of laughed. The fight between Red and Sasquatch was boring, as it feels like a fight I would have seen in a Cartoon Network show about a decade ago, making it all the more unoriginal. And Blue ends up punished in the end because, of course he is. That's now his character and nothing else, as this joke has just become less clever and funny, and rather more mean-spirited and cringe-inducing. I didn't care at all for this episode, and the fact that Red and Blue get beat up all because Red said pussy, I don't understand how that's supposed to piss him off. Yeah, this episode pissed me off even more than the previous episode. I will say it's a slight improvement, but still, it's just a really, really bad episode. And finally, episode 53, Wild Kingdom. Red and Blue are walking through the forest eating beef jerky, and for some reason Sasquatch just kinda comes in and beats them up again. This is the third episode where they've relied on nothing more than a cheap snack. This episode has so many problems. First of all, not just Blue, but Red gets beat up for no apparent reason. It wasn't Red or Blue who pissed Sasquatch off. I believe it was either the cameraman or some other guy who just left a trap in there. I don't know who the hell planted that mine, but I know for sure it wasn't Red and Blue, because seeing them just walking through nicely, eating some beef jerky, I pretty much knew it wasn't them. So why the fuck do they deserve to get beat up for no goddamn reason? This episode just makes me hate Sasquatch even more than the previous two episodes. Animals can be very fucking stupid sometimes, and this is no exception. The fact that this episode is so short gives you the biggest idea that they're clearly running out of ideas and trying to rely on some cute jokes. Not even the scene where the cameraman farted that pissed Sasquatch off wasn't even funny. It's still very stupid and very, very annoying. I'm sorry if my messing with Sasquatch episodes feel repetitive, because honestly, these episodes feel repetitive. This is not only a repetitive episode, but a very bad episode. And this is one of the worst episodes of Dick Figures I have ever seen in my life. And that is all of the bad episodes of Dick Figures reviewed. In total, Dick Figures has had 14 bad episodes. But that doesn't mean it makes Dick Figures a bad series. Compared to all the other episodes I've seen in Dick Figures, for the most part, Dick Figures is still a pretty good series. I don't think it's the best series I've ever seen or anything, and it's especially due to all these bad and okay episodes, but mixing them together, there's still more good episodes than all of the bad and okay episodes I've seen. Because this is a bad marathon, I'm also going to be doing something I haven't done in a while. This is my top 5 least favorite episodes of all time. If I ever did a good episode marathon, I'd most likely do a top 5 favorites, but these are the ones that pissed me off the most. At number 5, we have Ocho Muerte. Red had absolutely no point in this episode. It was basically an everything bad happens to Blue episode. At number 4, we have The Red Planet. It had some good promising qualities in there, but in the end, it just turned out to be a giant middle finger to the audience. At number 3, Taco Tuesday. Repetitive jokes, awkward violence, and a lot of really, really awkward humor. At number 2, Terminator. This episode relies solely on references for the most part, and it's not even funny. Also, Blue gets tortured a lot throughout this episode by a douchey girlfriend and an idiotic friend. And of course, at number 1, Trash God. Out of all the episodes I've seen, this is the one that pissed me off the most, because it just basically made fun of Blue and how he's being treated around in this episode, almost like as if no one even cares about him. That's kinda sad. But, on the bright side, at least Dick Figures still has more good episodes than bad. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you all guys in my next review.